Support for Lab Out Loud is brought to you by the National Science Teachers Association. Find out more at nsta.org. Hello, Lab Out Loud listeners. This is Dale, and just a few announcements before we get started with today's show. Brian and I want to remind you that there are some NSTA conferences that are just around the corner. Look out for the big regional conference in Charlotte, North Carolina. It will be running from November 29th through December 1st. And of course, let's not forget about the national conference, which will be next year, April 11th through the 14th in St. Louis. Also, listeners, if you'd like to support our show and show how much you love Lab Out Loud, you can pledge as little as $1 per month at our Patreon page. Head on over to our Lab Out Loud website and look for the Become a Patron button to learn more. And finally, if you're still looking for one of those last-minute gifts for one of your favorite teachers of science, Lab Out Loud also has t-shirts. You can find the link at our website, laboutloud.com. You're listening to the Lab Out Loud podcast, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And today we're talking to a guest who is encouraging us to slow down, take some time, and think about the Earth.
I think we just urgently need better, more Earth-literate citizens. And so whether everybody goes into geology or not is not really the point. It's to have people, voters, who understand how the planet works, how water systems work. That, to me, is an urgent priority as a society. Almost every place has a story. And I think it's a great way to get people engaged so people know landscapes or, state parks that are favorite family destinations.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud. But first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
And today, Brian and I are talking to someone who we both know.
I'm Marcia Bjornerud.
This is one of those where I have to say that I have to maybe give full disclosure if that is appropriate. I don't know. Marcia is my neighbor. She's actually farther away right now. She's at her office across the river, but she is usually just a few blocks down from me in my neighborhood there. And I also taught one of Marcia's children in school.
That's right. Yes.
But even though you're actually in our backyard, the funny thing is, I was reading your article in Wired magazine, and I was thinking to myself, well, this would be an interesting topic for Lab Out Loud. And I looked down at the author, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute.
Well, we've been following some of your stuff earlier, I think from the New Yorker, correct? You had a column there?
Yeah, occasionally I've contributed, especially after large earthquakes, to try to explain to the public their tectonic context.
So I guess for people who don't know who you are, Marcia, can you tell us a little bit about your work?
I'm a professor of geosciences at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. And so I teach courses in a wide range of the geological sciences, from introductory courses, of course, to hard rock classes in igneous and metamorphic petrology, as well as tectonics and seismology. And I'm involved with the Environmental Studies program here on campus.
I've mentioned to Dale we should get Marcia on the show. She is my neighbor, but she's got some good stuff. So but now you have a book out. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right. So the new book is called Timefulness, and the subtitle is How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World.
Is this a little takeoff on mindfulness that's been very popular?
Yeah, so I coined the word, I think, although maybe others had thought of it earlier. So timefulness kind of rhymes with mindfulness. And in that sense, I want people to be thinking about pausing and thinking more deliberately about our place in time. But it's also a deliberate counterpoint to timelessness, which we think is something we might want to aspire to. If something is timeless, it somehow exists outside the earthly sphere. But in my view, timelessness is kind of a sterile idea. It means nothing ever changes, whereas the natural world is shaped, I would even argue, kind of made by time. It's timeful. So it's both a kind of play on mindfulness and timelessness.
And you actually invoke quite a lot of powerful words in your writing, and along this concept of timefulness. And one of the ones that I love is the chronophobic nature of some people and things like that. Did you have fun with that?
I think I'm kind of a closet linguist. In fact, when I first started college, I had some dim idea that I wanted to go into linguistics without probably understanding what linguistics was all about. But I've always been kind of a word person. So, yeah, I hope readers will forgive me for inventing some new ones.
Well, Dale's actually the geology. He's got the geology background in there. I had a few courses in college, but my area was more in biological science and chemistry. However, the biological science piece is, I'm tuned into that quite a bit because of thinking about our exploration of time as it relates to evolution, and those are tightly linked, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think that all biologists should take a course in the history of the Earth, because that's been the backdrop on which evolution has played out. But yes, the biological and geological sciences are intimately connected with each other. There is a new kind of emergent field that's called biogeochemistry that is really shining light on the intimate interconnections between biological processes, geological processes, the hydrosphere, the water system on Earth, and I think we're just starting to appreciate the complexity of all those things.
And maybe other planets as well.
Possibly, but so far, no clear evidence, of course, of biospheres.
Sure.
So can you give us an example of what you would call timefulness?
Well, I think it's a habit of mind, and it really is the way geologists see the world. To me, geology is a kind of lens through which to see in four dimensions, if we count time as a fourth dimension. A metaphor, I use it in the book and that I often use when I try to explain to people how geologists think, is the idea of a palimpsest manuscript, which is a word that medievalists use for a parchment that was inked and then later reused and scraped of the earlier writing and then re-inked. But inevitably there's some vestigial remnant of the first writing underneath the more recent one. And that is very apt metaphor for how we look at landscapes. You can always see partial erasure, but survival of earlier iterations of the way any particular landscape looks. And you can extend that back further and further in time. Of course, the very earliest entries become a little harder to read. But it's that habit of looking out on the land and seeing it's not always been the way it is now on this temporal plane. It has many iterations of itself. And to me, that informs me not only as a scientist, but as a human being. It reminds me I'm in a place that has a deep and old history.
I think that's one of the challenges of teaching earth science to high schoolers also, because I think they're a little bit more tuned in to live in the immediate, just the way their brains are working. So it makes it a challenge for them to kind of appreciate things like history and the time before, because they're really looking for, can we see this feature or this event now?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And we as humans are like that anyway, but I think the adolescent years are all about the here and the now and the immediate, and that is particularly challenging. The one sense that becomes more acute as you age is a sense of time. So,
have you found any success breaking through to some of your students or just people who are, a strategy to get them to take a breath, I guess, and appreciate that time?
I think getting out in the field is the most effective way to get people learning through their feet and interact as directly as possible with the natural world. Short of that, bringing in really sensory experiences through technologies is a substitute for that. But to use the whole brain and use the senses as a way of engaging with the natural world is probably the best way.
Yeah, that I would say that's the second biggest challenge with earth science is that you can pull out the samples, you can go through slides. I know there's VR experiences now, but I think sometimes, in its current iterations, those are getting in the way sometimes.
Or they become cheaper substitutes of a field trip. So
yeah, and they if you're trying to teach earth science, no one's got a travel budget, but you just can't get that sense of awe that I had later when I went to college and did like field camp. And I remember standing alone in the Badlands, slightly dehydrated, and then having that moment. And that's hard to come by, I think, in a high school classroom.
Yeah, and as you say, kids' minds maybe not quite receptive yet to some of those cosmic moments. But if you can find a few ways to find those receptors in the brain, I think we need to start earlier. For one thing, elementary school kids love rocks and dinosaurs, and if we can build a scaffolding of understanding. I guess one thing I feel frustrated with as someone who teaches at the college level is that we have very few kids who come in to our campus or anywhere else who know much about geology as a legitimate intellectual endeavor, because it's just not represented much in high school curricula, at least in the same way that physics and chemistry and biology tend to be. And so we don't have people who are coming in with a framework for understanding already. And most of our majors, and I'm in this group too, discovered geology almost by accident. Did you, Dale, too? Or?
Yep. I went to college for music.
Wow.
And
okay.
Yeah, let's talk about a shift. I went to college at UW-Oshkosh for music, and I had to take a physical geology class, and I loved it. Now I would say I did have a freshman class with earth science, and the teacher was really engaging and kind of maybe put down the first layers. Layers,
so to speak. Yes.
Yeah, and so that gave me a hook to come back to. And then what that class did is I did good in that class, and they sent out like a little letter. Have you ever considered geology?
Very good.
And it was good because that came at the time where I was like, this music stuff is taking it was competitive and not a direction I wanted to go, and so it was perfect.
Right, but you were lucky to have some exposure, in school before that. Yeah, I think we just urgently need better, more Earth literate citizens. And so whether everybody goes into geology or not is not really the point. It's to have people, voters, who understand how the planet works, how water systems work. That, to me, is an urgent priority as a society.
We've talked about scientific literacy a lot on the show, and we can actually see in ways where our curriculum has changed to try and address that. In my lifetime as a science educator, we saw geology standards that were pushed into the biology curriculum as a way to address some of those things that weren't getting addressed. And I think the result of it was that, we don't need to have as much focus on geology if it's happening in biology. But at the same token, it wasn't addressed fully or by people who felt comfortable with their geology background to teach it well. And I think there was a well-meaning in that process, but at the same token, I think the result was it actually made things worse.
Yeah.
Is there a particular example? Maybe it's we're here by the Great Lakes, but it could be something else for our listeners to get a sense of. You look at this phenomena that we have now, but there's this rich story, all this time behind it, this story that people might be missing. Is there an example that you could tell us a little bit about that would kind of let our listeners know what we mean by this?
Well, almost every place has a story like that, so
sure.
It's hard for me to pick even. But and I think it's a great way to get people engaged, so people know landscapes or state parks that are favorite family destinations, and those are great ways to kind of hook people and tell them the story, and then maybe make them curious about others. Here we're
Caves,
just below
I think.
Sorry.
Caves. We went to a cave this summer, and that was, again, the story of how that came to be. And Discovery was I think, a tie-in for my children as well. This was a fascinating phenomenon. Yeah.
So here we're just below the Niagara Escarpment, which is a good example of a place that has an interesting and long history. So it's the same ledge of rock over which Niagara falls way over in New York and Ontario. And that has its roots really deep in Wisconsin's history. The rock itself was deposited in a warm, shallow, tropical marine environment, probably like the Bahamas today. and it's part of a much larger feature called the Michigan Basin, which is a big, deep bowl that accumulated sediment over hundreds of millions of years. And the escarpment is the kind of upturned rim of that bowl that you can track all the way from eastern Wisconsin through Door County, which is the thumb of Wisconsin, up to Escanaba in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then all the way over to Niagara Falls. And so it's this regional feature. It's formed of rock that was a record of a warm, shallow sea that covered our area, and then over eons of erosion has become this step in the landscape that hosts an ecosystem that's a really distinctive thing. It's hundreds of miles long and about half a mile wide. And then there are environmental issues that people need to know on the escarpment. The rock itself, which is dolomite, has vertical fractures that create essentially super highways for groundwater and are a really serious problem for people who have wells up on the escarpment. So it's satisfying to kind of understand why this thing exists, just to have a rational explanation for the landscape, but then there are practical reasons for understanding the rocks as well for, in this case, groundwater protection. So, I mean, every place you start kind of looking at that palimpsest sort of landscape idea, and you uncover many layers of stories. And
when I think about the Niagara Escarpment, and we walk through it many times throughout the season because it's right in our backyard. It's there's a state park there, High Cliff State Park, and so we like to go through there, and we like to talk about what the geology, how did that form and what's there. And again, it kind of goes all the way under the Great Lakes to end in the Niagara Falls there. And that fascinates my children to think about that and what it used to be. But there's also an economic story tied in there as well, because this was an area where limestone was harvested and, converted into lime there, and that just seeing the lime kilns there. But we've had a kind of a sordid history with economics and with geology, haven't we?
Yeah, geology is kind of a weird field in that it has this kind of venal, maybe resource exploitation aspect, as well as this cosmic, almost philosophical side, because it's about these deep questions of origins and how we came to be. So there is a tension there, and I know a lot of us go into the field because we love being outside. We feel connected to nature, and then, frankly, many geologists end up going into the oil and gas or mineral industries, and so there is kind of this dissonance in some ways within the field. But that makes it, many of the things we know about the Earth, frankly, have come about because of economic priorities. On the other hand, anyone who is in this field, I think, does develop some kind of reverence for the planet and its long history.
I remember several roadside geology stops for several of my undergrad classes, and that's, we'd be driving along and then, two vans stop and a bunch of geology students get out and we look here. I'm assuming you do that too. And that is the thing I would always appreciate. And then it helped me learn geology too, because each time you learned about a new process, it basically sort of like, to me, it was like unlocking a key that helped you see farther back in time, in essence.
Absolutely. Yeah, I often say geology is the etymology of the world. For word origins, I love understanding how did that word come down to us. And for me, geology has this huge explanatory power. It just makes the world seem logical. And in my bones, I think most people want that. They want a rational explanation for things. And so I'm hopeful that if it were more available through our education system or adult education, people would be receptive. And so we need somehow to convey that part of geology. It's not just about rocks and minerals in boxes or dinosaurs. It explains everything.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that as a jumping off point, starting with that, and even thinking back to the elementary school classroom, you don't have to think about the box of rocks and just, this one's this and this one's that. Mm-hmm. If we could tie those to the history behind each one, I think
absolutely.
That would be
I mean, I always say rocks are verbs, not nouns. They're records of processes that happen.
You really do like the language.
Yeah, I do. It's the liberal artsy side of me.
Yes.
I'm writing down possible titles for the show, and I've got like a few here. Okay, and maybe we can also take it in a different direction. Sometimes we like to talk about careers in science that students might want to invest in the future. And beyond the oil and the gas industry, where could we make money in geology without sacrificing the planet in the process?
Right. Well, environmental consulting, environmental law. I think we urgently need people in positions of leadership to know more about the Earth. They're making decisions for the rest of us for the long haul, and in the main, sadly, are very science illiterate. So, to take a scientific background into politics, law, business, that's really where you could probably make a bigger difference, because most of the people in those fields have very little background in the sciences.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because we just had someone on the show recently who talked about that from the biology lens, but also that there's a lot of opportunities to have a science mind in law right now. And partly that's just in how we address problem solving, but also just having a background in natural sciences is going to be a benefit for you in the future.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So how else do you think we can address this issue of time in the classroom, even from the youngest age through college? Do you have a quick take-home message for us?
Well, I think revisiting it over and over. I mean, you're in the K-12 business, and I'm sure you realize you can't just teach something and move on and assume students have got it. It's a recursive process. You have to kind of keep revisiting and deepening understanding. And so I guess I would be an advocate for having geology early and often in the curriculum, woven in organic ways. Even if we can't have standalone earth science classes, make sure that we really are deepening children's sense of who they are on this planet, and
with intentional iteration too. Right.
Yeah. I don't know that any of us really can ever understand what billions of years mean, but we can have some sense of the intrinsic time scales of natural processes like groundwater flow or climate change. We urgently need to have some sense of proportion there. And I think that's what's lacking in our society as a whole. We just have no clue how the rates of human-induced change compare with natural systems and how they're intersecting and how they will interact and evolve, co-evolve in complex ways. It's a lack of temporal proportion is what I would say. It's as if
I'm writing that down.
Distances. Mm-hmm. If you didn't know the difference between the distance between New York and LA, people have no sense of time distance in a sense. So if we could strive to develop depth of field as people think about geologic processes, that would be an aspiration.
I think we're looking for, tell us this, what are 6 great lessons you can start off with right away? But, it just doesn't work that way, particularly because we're probably looking for that perception shift to take place first.
Yeah.
Where we do stop looking at geology as this is how we get stuff out of the earth, or this is how we dig through put in new roads and things like that. This is how we use the earth, as opposed to seeing how this is part of our story. Right,
exactly. And I think we've probably overemphasized as geologists how old the earth is and how slowly things change, and in a way that's very alienating. And I think people have had the sense, the geologic past, there's this disjunction between that and us. We're separate. And part of it is to get some sense that we're on a continuum. We're part of geologic time. And yes, the earth is old. And yes, our particular species has arrived relatively recently, but we have really deep roots in this planet. Everything about us is adapted to this planet and its evolution. And so I think, establishing that sense of connection and continuity is a big part of it. And some of the metaphors we use, like the 24-hour clock for geologic time, while it's technically accurate, saying if all of geologic time were a 24-hour period, we humans just barely walked on the last second before midnight. We all use that, but I think in some ways it sends the wrong message. It's very alienating. It excuses us for all the damage that we've been able to do in that last fraction. And it has this unintentional sort of apocalyptic thing. It's like, what happens when the clock strikes midnight? Is that the end of time? So I think we have to be careful sometimes in the ways that we're trying to convey these things, sending unintentional messages.
Advance the apocalypse.
Actually end up alienating people.
It's interesting that astronomy seems to have, I don't know, I don't look at it as astronomy as being, to me it has some of the same characteristics of, the huge time story that when we study it and things like that. But for some reason, I think that grabs the public a bit more.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Why
I don't
is
know
that?
if it's sci-fi or, that we just all look up at the sky and we're just not looking down enough.
Right.
I don't know.
I mean, it's wrapped up, of course, with, our origin stories and maybe astronomy isn't as controversial in those ways. I'm not sure, but that's an interesting observation. Yeah.
Looking into the skies and outward to learn more about our process of how we became here. And I do think that's important when we're starting to look at, what are some planets out there that might have Earth-like characteristics. Now we can start to sense that, well, first of all, we're not alone. That's one of the things that, not necessarily alone in terms of the organic matter, but are we alone in terms of this, our place and time here in our solar system? That's replicated somewhere else somehow, or at least in a similar fashion that way. And maybe that's starting to bring that more into the public sphere of accepting that time there.
Maybe, although as I write in the first chapter in the book, it's a little sad to me that some geologists who study the Precambrian, which is 8/9 of Earth's history, but the earlier parts of Earth's story have had to seek funding by calling themselves astrobiologists, and kind of wrap themselves in the glamour of the space program to get funding to study our own planet.
Yeah.
It's interesting you mentioned that too, because when we go to science trade shows, there's often, sometimes you can get, like I remember going to where we could get samples of minerals and stuff, but they're all usually funded by corporations that want to use these industries and telling us how great they are and what we can use them for. But I'm often a little wary of some of those resources because I feel like they have an ulterior motive there.
Yeah. On the other hand, if they're the only choice, I don't know.
Well,
but we somehow need to get the space-like excitement back, when we look at the Earth, and that's a challenge. How do we make it seem cosmically engaging in the same way? I find it that way, but we need to help geology with its little PR problem, which is either dusty museum collection or the oil and gas industry, I guess.
I know we're short on time here, but from what I've been learning from you, this is nothing in the grand scheme of our geologic time. So, but in any case, I do wonder. I know you mentioned let's get out and learn with your feet. But has technology helped this at all in the classroom? And I may be thinking of like using Google Earth and drone technology, for instance. Are those ways that we can incite some people to get outside after that?
I think so. I think I've taught geology now for almost 30 years, and I've realized that one of the really challenging things is our tendency to zoom in and out of both time, but also spatial scales. Like we'll be at an outcrop, and then suddenly we're talking about a subduction zone on it. We're assuming that people can easily make the conceptual leap from the local to a much bigger scale. And so certainly some of these technologies, Google Maps and Google Earth and drones, help with that, that we can see the macro, the micro, and hold that in our mind's eye. So I think some of these technological tools have been really helpful. On the other hand, I'm sure this is something many teachers experience all the time that some of them make us lazy. And
Sure.
I've seen students' capacity to read maps deteriorate because they don't really have to think about it too much if they're driving around with GPS in their cars. It's constantly reorienting the map, so it's going the direction they're going. They have a hard time just looking at a map and interpreting it. So I think it can go both ways. It can really help with visualization, but if you don't ever have to flex your intellectual muscles on your own, it can kind of make you lazy.
Well, it doesn't do well at big picture, I think. We traveled across the U.S. a couple times on some car rides, and we brought those paper maps, and they give you... I mean, certainly the GPS helps tremendously, but without the big paper maps, I don't think you have the full...
You're not engaging with the geography in the same way, I don't think.
Yeah, you don't look forward enough, I also think.
Well, it gives you a
backwards
sense
even.
of scale, too. And I think about this, there's some research talking about when you actually have a physical paper book in your hand, you can feel where you are in the book and how close you are to finishing, for instance.
Yes.
Full disclosure here, I only bought the Kindle version of your book, Marcia, but nevertheless, I think the map is the same thing.
So
A paper
smart,
map.
Brian.
Well, a paper map, when you have it in a digital, like a Google Maps there, you only get the here and the now, versus on a paper map, you can be like, oh, I only traveled this part of the state.
Yeah, again, that's that sense of proportion that
Well, at least it gives us something to start thinking about. Now I need to get the paper version of Timefulness to offset Brian, and then we can do a controlled study.
I was thinking paper maps for Christmas gifts. Like that's, everyone's getting a map for Christmas now. And in any case, well, thank you so much for your time, Marcia. And the book is Timefulness, and check it out. It's been a very comfortable read so far, and again, this is my neighbor, so you help out my neighborhood with this purchase.
Brian gets a free yard leaf raking out of this somehow. I don't know.
Well, what's funny though is that Marcia has a little book stop outside of her house.
A little free library. Yep.
A little free library, and my kids go there all the time.
Is it going to be stocked with Timefulness now?
Yeah.
You should just put like one in there. Come on.
The page or a chapter here.
Signed by the author. Yeah, there you go. Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time.
It was fun. Thank you. Bye-bye.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
Brian, I can't help noticing that before you said something like voices from beyond or something like that, or no, that we are not alone. You said we are not alone, and your dog Gracie went right at the exact same time.
She's got to be right by me, and so she's down
wants
here
to be
and
in every podcast.
She moans and groans, and there's kids running upstairs, so she's growling. I'm like,
it was almost like on cue. It was like, and we are not alone.